Hello everyone, today I've prepared a really fascinating game for you. On top of that, during the game there was a rather funny moment when Magnus and Ian burst into unstoppable laughter for almost 30 seconds. Make sure to watch the analysis all the way until the end, and I'll reveal the secret of why they laughed so much. Enjoy! This game was played with rapid time control in 2019. Ian Nepomniachtchi had the white pieces, and he begins the game with pawn to e4. Magnus replies with pawn to c5, and after both knights are developed, we see pawn to d4, black captures on d4, the knight recaptures, and we enter the Sicilian defense. Magnus strikes back with pawn to e5, fighting strongly for the center. Ian retreats his knight to b5, with the unpleasant threat of jumping into d6 with check. That would force black to give up his bishop for the knight, very annoying. So Magnus plays pawn to d6, preventing that jump. Then Ian develops his second knight, and after pawn to a6, the white knight must retreat to a3. Magnus calmly develops with bishop to e7, pawn to g3. Knight to f6, and after bishop to g2, Magnus pushes on the queenside with pawn to b5. Now comes the dangerous threat of pawn to b4, forking both of white's knights. So Ian plays knight to d5, offering an exchange. Magnus accepts, capturing with the knight, and after the pawn recaptures, the black knight has to go back to the stable. But that's not a big problem, from there it can maneuver toward the kingside later, or land on c5. Ian castles, finishing his king's development, and Magnus places his knight on d7. White responds with pawn to c4, challenging black's pawn structure on the queenside and threatening to capture on b5, possibly winning the pawn. Magnus doesn't seem worried. He castles, and after the capture on b5, he recaptures. Ian refuses to take the b5 pawn, because Magnus had prepared this position deliberately. If white takes, black could activate his bishop with bishop to a6, pinning the white knight on b5 against the rook on f1, and gaining great counterplay on the queenside. Instead, Ian plays knight to c2, planning to reroute via b4 into c6, an excellent outpost. Magnus strikes in the center with pawn to f5, pushing forward on the kingside. Knight to b4, Ian sticks to his plan. Magnus continues development with bishop to f6, placing it on a powerful diagonal. If black later plays pawn to e4, that bishop will explode open along the long diagonal. The white knight lands on c6, hitting the black queen. The queen is forced to retreat, and Magnus chooses queen to e8, keeping options to join the kingside attack. Then comes pawn to a4, Ian pushes forward on the queenside, aiming to activate his rook from a1. If black captures, white will take back with the rook, opening the a-file for attack. But Magnus is not so simple-minded. He prefers to capture with the knight. He plays knight to c5, eyeing the pawn on a4 so that he can take it with the knight instead of the pawn, avoiding the opening of the file. White develops his last minor piece with bishop to e3, but this move allows Magnus to grab the pawn on a4 with his knight. And Magnus seizes the chance immediately. Now Ian plays queen to c2, with the tricky idea of going pawn to b3, kicking the knight away, and then the black rook on a8 will be hanging undefended. Magnus plays bishop to d7, attacking the knight on c6 and at the same time defending his rook on a8 with the queen. Still, the move pawn to b3 follows anyway, and after some thought, Magnus decides to counterattack and sharpen the position to the absolute maximum. He pushes pawn to f4, hitting the bishop on e3 and leaving his knight on a4 under attack. Now the exchanges begin. White captures on a4, Magnus recaptures on e3, and white calmly takes the pawn on b5. At this point, white has a strong passed pawn on the b-file, but black has partially exposed the white king. After taking on a1, the rooks are exchanged, rook takes a1. Magnus doesn't rush to capture the pawn on f2. Instead, he keeps the pressure with a very strong move, bishop to g5. It looks as if he's inviting white to take on e3, but in that case, the black bishop suddenly becomes very powerful. After bishop takes e3, the king is forced back, and then the bishop would land on the perfect c5 square, still holding back the dangerous b-pawn. Ian spots Magnus' sneaky idea and refuses the exchange. Instead, he pushes pawn to b6, and suddenly his pawn is just 2 steps away from queening. Magnus, completely cold-blooded, grabs the pawn on f2. That pawn cannot be taken, or white would lose the queen. So Ian steps aside with king to h1, and Magnus continues with bishop to c8, keeping the white pawn frozen in place. For now, the queen side has stalled, so Ian plays rook to f1, targeting the pawn on f2. If white manages to take it, things will look very good for him. But Magnus has other plans. He calmly plays queen to f7, reinforcing the pawn and preparing to swing his queen to e2. The point is that black now threatens bishop to a6, an unpleasant move kicking the rook off the f-file, followed by pushing his pawn forward. By placing the queen on e2, white covers all the critical light squares in the position. Then Magnus strikes with pawn to e4, sacrificing a pawn. And here's the catch: white cannot take this pawn with the bishop, because then comes bishop to h3. If white answers with the seemingly logical bishop to g2, black simply captures on g2, the king recaptures, and then the black queen takes the white knight on d5, completely collapsing white's position. However, if white captures with the queen on e4, then things are fine, black doesn't have a direct attack. True, there's the move bishop to a6, attacking the rook, but then white calmly plays queen to e6, offering a queen trade and pinning black's queen to the king. If black takes on f1, white recaptures with the bishop, and suddenly black is a bit stuck. He might try king to h8 to trade queens, but then white pushes h4, gaining space. And despite being down the exchange, white has the strong passed b-pawn. Even after checks like queen to f3, white can simply slide the king to h2, reinforcing the g3 pawn. Now, with the queen no longer controlling the 7th rank, white threatens b7 and b8 equals q next move. So in fact, the position is dynamically balanced. But for a human sitting at the board, it's almost impossible to figure all this out. And in the actual game, Ian didn't go for this computer line. Instead, he chose the more human move pawn to h4, pushing away the dark squared bishop and declining the pawn sacrifice on e4. Everything would have been fine after h4, if the bishop had retreated. But Magnus finds an almost computer-like reply. He plays pawn to e3, sacrificing his bishop on g5. Now black gets two monsters on e3 and f2, terrifying passed pawns. Ian Nepomniachtchi accepts the bishop sacrifice on g5, forcing Magnus to reveal what his idea was. Why did he give up that bishop? Magnus plays rook to e8, the pawn on e3 was hanging, and now it's solidly protected by the rook. White continues with king to h2, so as not to run into backrank checks later. But then Magnus unveils his true plan. He plays bishop to g4, sacrificing his second bishop. It turns out white has no choice but to take it. If the bishop is ignored, then after queen to h5 check, white would have to block, and mate would follow in just a couple of moves. So Ian captures on g4, Magnus' second bishop sacrifice, and then comes pawn to e2. Now the black pawns are just one step away from queening. White's rook on f1 is under attack, and it's not clear how to stop the pawns. Giving up on f2 is impossible, otherwise the pawn promotes. Ian tries to complicate things with pawn to b7, threatening to queen himself with b8. Because if black, for example, goes e1 equals q right away, white simply promotes 2, and we'd reach a crazy position. After the exchange on b8, white takes with the rook, and with two queens on the board, black has no winning chances. In fact, in that position, white would even be better. So after b7, Magnus calmly accepts the pawn sacrifice with rook takes b7. And Ian's idea was to finally grab on f2, eliminating at least one of the black pawns. But black immediately queens the other pawn, and after promotion, the new queen defends f5, covering the rook on f2. Plays queen to e3, then rook to f3, kicking the queen away. Magnus retreats with queen to e2. Now the knight jumps to d4, attacking the queen and threatening to land on e6. If that happens, white would even have mating threats, for example, queen to f8, sacrificing the queen, and after capture, mate would follow with the knight. Magnus finds the only move to keep the edge, queen to e5, offering a queen trade. This way, white cannot get in knight to e6, because the queens would be exchanged, and the position would be lost for white. Ian avoids the trade, keeping up the pressure, and still wants to bring the knight to e6. But black strikes first, capturing on d5. At first glance, it looks like Magnus blundered. White could try rook sacrifice on f8, followed by a discovered attack on the queen. But unfortunately for white, it doesn't work. Black simply takes, and after recapturing on d5, black plays queen takes d5. And the result is a hopeless position for white, down a pawn, a dangerous passed pawn, no less, down the exchange, and with his king in terrible shape. Ian understands this would be a lost cause, so instead of going for it, after the capture on d5 he plays knight to f5, keeping tension alive. But black's two queens still dominate, and Magnus begins tightening the screws. Queen to e6, pinning the knight to the queen. White tries queen to h5, avoiding exchanges, but Magnus plays queen to g6. Then queen to g4, and Magnus pushes h5, driving the queen even further away. If white tries en passant, it leads to nothing, he would simply lose his unprotected queen on g4. Ian is forced to give check with queen to c4, Magnus calmly blocks with pawn to d5. White's queen runs to b5, but then black captures on g5. After queen to d7, Magnus begins his own attack on the white king with the move h4. Now, taking on h4 is absolutely impossible. If white captures with the knight, then comes queen takes h4, and because of the pin, the pawn cannot recapture the queen. And if white doesn't take the pawn but instead retreats the rook, Magnus simply takes on g3 himself. After the king steps back to g1, Magnus plays pawn to g6, chasing away the knight. But that allows white to check with bishop to d5. However, black simply runs with the king to h8. And now, there are no checks available, no way to get to g7, because the queen is covering that square. Checkmate threats also don't exist, and the white knight is under attack. But where can the knight even go? There's no square left where it wouldn't be captured. For example, if the knight retreats to d6, then black immediately delivers a swift checkmate. It starts with queen to e3 check, and the mating net is unstoppable. For instance, queen to e2 check, king g1, and queen to h2 mate. That's why, after Magnus calmly retreated his king to h8 following white's check, Ian Nepomniachtchi resigned the game. And now about that burst of laughter that happened during the game, the one that lasted nearly 30 seconds. After the round ended, Magnus Carlsen explained in an interview that both he and Ian could hear applause coming from the commentary room next door, where commentators were analyzing the players' games live for the audience. And it just so happened that every single time Magnus or Ian made a move, they heard applause right away. What made it funny was that it happened only during their moves, and not at any other moments. If you look at Ian's face in that clip, you can see he's genuinely puzzled about what kind of prank was going on. In any case, that's the little funny story behind their laughter during the game. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.